out in the sun. I wish I was there. Although it's nice here in Portland too.
Good, but this is the new studio. I've moved location, and I do have an office, but it's a little stuffy, and it's not outside here, so
You are
why not?
you are a role model for me in terms of the sun, my relationship to the sun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, all kinds of good things.
yeah,
So one thing that we were chatting about is um, that there's a conversation going on that I'm seeing popping up in a lot of different places online amongst acupuncture professionals, and is this topic of a lot of acupuncture colleges closing,
yes,
and people maybe speculating as to why, and is this bad, is this good, is it neither? And I thought it would be interesting, especially to hear some of your thoughts and experience on this, as well, as a trained medical doctor, where you have that educational background, and then you've been an educator for a long time, and I understand that you were a teacher at one of the colleges and you had some experiences with that, and then also in some ways, like, how alternative education models may fit in and provide one possible pathway here. And I have my own perspective to add as someone who got my acupuncture training outside of the United States. And so I have my kind of outsider's perspective on
yeah,
some of these topics.
yes. Okay. Wow, what a multi-layered discussion this will be, and kind of inside the beltway for Chinese medical professionals. Yeah, it is. It is strange they seem to be closing all at once, isn't it?
It seems to be a bunch. Now, one thing I was curious about is, are colleges and other professions also closing?
That I don't know. Yeah.
Mhm. So that's one thing I don't see people ask, or I haven't seen as many people ask. Everyone's assuming that there's something about acupuncture. There may be something more, like, in the wider context happening. I
Yeah.
don't know. That's a question.
Yeah. One thing is certain, that change and transformation is the only certain thing. So things are either they're changing, or they're set, that's kind of the definition of an illness, is when things stay the same. So change and transformation is part of the game, and if schools are closing, that's part of change and transformation. We have to look at why.
Mhm.
What thoughts have you had about it?
Well, I have my thoughts, and then I have, like, kind of what I'm seeing people discuss, and one theme that comes up a lot, and I'll kind of just touch on these different ideas, is that, we're a clinical profession, so we go into this training, and the vast majority, will graduate and need to become small business owners and may struggle. They're not being equipped with skills to set up a business, so then they're unable to earn an income to, cover the cost of their education and pay off their loans, and that's not the whole story. I saw some interesting counterpoints to that, and I don't remember which college, so I apologize. Someone was saying, "Look, we went to this college that had stellar acupuncture training, and most of us as professionals are killing it, So that they didn't have the business training, but because they're so good at treating, that they're doing well." So there's different options there, but um, there seems to be this case where the math isn't mathing on the cost of the education and the loans that people are taking out and their ability to repay it, and that seems to be one of the main touch points that people have when they're talking about the schools closing.
Yeah, there's so many parts to this story, I have to say, and my experience is so different. I went to University of New Mexico Medical School, which funded its medical students so they could go into primary care. So my tuition was $800 a semester, and I graduated with no debt, and that's very so unusual. And then I did work here in a school in Portland for a while, and I did leave, mostly because of the financial issues for students. And I have to pause and say here that I don't think the schools are full of bad people trying to steal people's money and things like that. I found in the schools that there's a lots of people who are mission driven and dedicated to helping students learn, and wonderful teachers. So I don't think this is a plot, to but I was very concerned to see particularly young people who hadn't had experience with handling finances and the issue of financial aid. And So it was very easy at the school to have the students come into the financial aid office and be offered lots of money, with the promise that they'd, make lots of money, and sign up for loans that were 200, 300, $400,000 sometimes,
Yeah.
wow, which it should never, ever, ever be anything like that. And these are students who don't really have the experience with handling money sometimes because they're 20,
Yeah.
21, and they don't really know what's involved in like how hard it is to run a business and make money and overhead and pay for clinic space and so forth. And then after they would graduate, and by the way, the students in Chinese medicine school, some of the loveliest people I've ever worked with. They came to school with a real heartfelt desire to help and change the world and improve things. Sometimes they were coming back for a second profession, so there was kind of two cohorts, younger people and older people, really heartfelt people wanting to do good. And but then after they would graduate, then I'd be getting calls from students like, I'm living in my car, I can't pay off my student debt, in tears. And I began to feel, I this isn't accurate, but I began to feel like, am I working for an organized crime family? It's like out, like just extorting people and doing, which is not the case, but it felt like I can't be on the side of this. I can't
Mm.
be part of this happening. It didn't feel good. Um, so that was my experience there, and there's multiple levels of that. You know, if you're running a business, you're in a marketplace, and there's the value for money, and people are going to pay you if they think you're doing something of value. Um, but if we look at acupuncture training, let's be honest too, in many cases, it's not as robust as it should be. For example, I went to medical school, and so we had 4 years of lectures and doing things. And at the end of graduating from medical school, like, we didn't know how to treat a sunburn. Like, you don't know anything after 4 years of medical school, really. A little bit. You learn everything as an intern and a resident. Those hours of doing apprenticeship learning, having someone watch you do it, teach you how to do it, then you teach it to someone else. We say, do see one, do one, teach one is that model, working long hours. We learned everything. And alternative medicine in general, complementary medicine, naturopathic medicine, chiropractic medicine, acupuncture really falls down in the residency area. Like, most students are kind of just shown the door at the end of pretty marginal clinical experiences. What do I mean by that? So they go to school for 4 years or 3 years. They study a lot then they get clinical year, and that's going to be with lots of different teachers. And often the teacher's not even in the room watching them do things. They'll come into a conference room, and a teacher will review the case, and they'll say, do these points. They'll go in, and they don't even get observed like doing it. That's one issue. And so then they get shown the door, you graduate, and then you realize, I don't really know how to do anything. And then you start this frantic dash for continuing education, like
Mm,
going.
I wanna pause just to kind of
Sure.
anticipate, like, different because this episode is probably gonna be geared more towards practitioners, and,
Right.
I wanna just point out that, you clearly know that there are a range of, scenarios.
Exactly. Yes.
Right? So you're talking about the mean based on quite a bit of experience, that there's gonna be perhaps some outliers where the clinical training undergrad's stellar,
Very
and probably
good.
some are worse than what you're talking about, but, like, that what you're saying is kind of a fair sum
It's a
of what's
summation.
going on in
Yeah.
general at the profession-wide level. So I just wanted to kinda anticipate, what's, like, a potential kinda like, "Wait a minute, my school was like this," you know?
No, absolutely. That's a great point. It varies a lot. This is a general mean that the internship training is usually weak, or weaker than it should be, or at least compared to my medical training, which was so robust in the residency part. By the time we were done, wow, we'd been through a lot, seen a lot. And then so that's one issue, you know, and so then they go out into the marketplace, and, you know, will people pay them money to do what they do? you know, that's an issue. Then there's other issues about education in general, and also Chinese medicine in the West in general. Because also there's this idea, for example, I see mostly cancer patients, and they're pretty sick, and this medicine's so helpful for them, but it's very specialized, requires a lot of training. I don't have the problem, finding the patients. I work with a sliding scale. I've never worked with insurance, you know, um, and people. So there is value for money, and people will pay if they can, and so forth. So there's issues about Chinese medicine practice and education, and you have to kind of go back and I don't know where to start with this, but you know, one thing is the idea that Chinese medicine is a complementary medicine. So that's like a whole issue. That has a lot of political implications for how we move through culture and so forth. Chinese medicine was never a complementary medicine, in China. It's not called traditional Chinese medicine. It's not called complementary. It's called medicine. One of the things that I was so struck with reading the Neijing was how many times I would see a description of a patient and go, "Oh, I've seen that person in the ICU. I've seen that person in the emergency room. This is high level care. These were the doctors for their day. They weren't doing complementary medicine."
I I mean, I wanna pause there because,
Sure.
just to point out kind of one of the perspectives that you're offering here for the profession, whether someone's listening and they have any intention of studying with you or not, but that it's so valuable, is that I don't think anyone can argue with, is that you're comparing the residential training and the clinical training to medical school, like regular medical school. You're comparing them to, and you're putting them on kind of an equal, uh, kind of playing field and saying, this is falling down. And then I can imagine for most acupuncturists being like, well, but we're not like real doctors. And it's like not like so dangerous. And we're not doing all this stuff and with these really sick people. But that's the next part of it, is that what you've discovered is that we can use this medicine like that if we're trained well, that we should start to be thinking of ourselves as real doctors who can treat real cases, and we need to be trained well and we can do it, but this in itself is a massive mindset shift for the entire profession. It's a big leap, but that's it's so valuable, and I think people need this.
Yeah, and I would just pause and say there's lots of reasons people get into Chinese medicine, and some people are just like, I want to like do facial acupuncture, and I don't want to like be a doctor, and that's fine. So there's lots of ways people can do this. But my understanding now is that the training we do, or how I envision it, is as rigorous as medical school, and honestly should take as long. We kind of pare it down to 2 years, but it really there's so much anatomy to learn. It's similar in scope as medical school. There's so much theory, and my experience as a physician, my first experiences using acupuncture were in the hospital. I had hospital privileges, so I mean it was in the ICU. That's where it works wonderfully if you know how to do it. I remember one of the first cases I may have told you about, when I was got my hospital privileges, and I was called in to see a woman who had fallen down and broken her knee, in a very bad fracture, and it had torn the popliteal arteries, and she was overweight and she was diabetic and her blood sugars were way out of control, and they had done a fasciotomy, which means they had to cut open her leg, and they had done an orthopedic repair and vascular surgery, so like a $200,000 hospital bill or something. She had developed not one but two nosocomial infections, and they were going to cut off her leg, and it was Tuesday and they were going to cut off her leg on Friday. And I went in there, and it was a terrible mess with a big soupy infection, open wound in the ICU. And I made a Chinese herbal poultice for that, and brought it in thermos jugs, you know. and was using the long needles to open up the hip and the knee and so forth. And I just took the towel and just dipped it in the wound. And by Friday, they were saying, "This looks a lot better. Let's postpone the surgery till next week." Next week it rolled around. It's looking a lot better. Finally, she was discharged, you know, and she went home and she has a leg. The cost of the herbs was $20. My time, needles were $5. That's my experience of using Chinese medicine. But you don't get that kind of training from our point of view in education. But that's my point of view. And the thing that's so important is if you go back and you study the Chinese medicine at depth from its sources, it also fills in this very important place that Western medicine doesn't cover very well. So Western medicine is pretty good about things, like cutting out tumors, treating an infection thing. It's not good at processes. What's the underlying process that brought the disease? What was the change in the oncology that allowed the disease to arise and be maintained? And Chinese medicine is wonderful for that if you understand it. Um, and so there's this way that this is not only an issue about, oh, acupuncture schools are closing. It's an issue like this medicine is desperately needed by the
Mhm.
world. And the profession right now is not expressing that level in many cases.
And, that kind of segues me into, it's perhaps a sore topic. I wanna be really careful because this is I think this is an important conversation to have, and any opinions I share is not for the point of being controversial. It is really just to have these conversations. And I also know, people who are advocates for our profession and work on certain boards and spend a lot of time and energy doing a lot of good work. So I wanna make sure that it doesn't sound like I'm being critical and unappreciative of that. But one other aspect to this that you reminded me of when you're telling that story is that a lot of the education is geared towards, sitting and passing board exams. And we have these national boards which, have, I would say, strengths and weaknesses to them in terms of their existence. That on the one hand, having a board certification, a national board certification brings us into the echelon of legitimate medical professions, and this is how other professions do things. And so it allows us to do certain things to people for acupuncturists to be employed by hospitals or to be covered by insurance or to be covered by Medicaid if that's a thing. And so it has those benefits. But on the other hand, what you're describing in terms of this sort of caliber of medicine, this rigor of medicine, and things that you've learned, like doesn't appear anywhere on that exam. you know.
No, and I agree with you. I'm a big proponent for Chinese medicine. I'm not a naysayer about Chinese medicine. I spent my life, promoting it. And I also, my point of view is that we're always doing our best with what we know. And I find very dedicated people in Chinese medicine. So I also agree with you. I don't want to say, be a naysayer about
And
them.
I was
And
speaking specifically to the people who, curate the exams and they spend their time doing
exactly,
that. You know what I mean? Yeah,
we're all trying with what we know,
yeah.
and that includes teachers and schools. But let's go back to what we know. So this is another thread of this. If you go to any Chinese medicine website, it usually has a kind of a spiel, which is Chinese medicine is 2,000 years old, blah, 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 blah. But we're not practicing that medicine from 2,000 years. We're mostly practicing and being trained in something called TCM, which actually developed in the 50s. So you have to know the history thread of this. And this goes back to like the founding of the Chinese Republic in 1912 with Sun Yat-sen, who was a Western physician studied in the West, was not for traditional medicine. Acupuncture particularly had fallen into disuse. All those threads through the century into the development of the PRC in 1949, and their attempts to struggle with traditional medicine, which was not, they were not embracing it, by the way. It was all based on political decisions, what to do, how to navigate things with the West, and public health issues primarily. Mao was not a big proponent of Chinese medicine. And then they had this group of people, and up until that time, 1950, education in Chinese medicine had always been, lineage learning and studying of the classics, the Tao Te Ching, the Shan Hong Lun, Neijing, et cetera, et cetera. Um, at that time, and I don't know if people know this story, but I'll just kind of summarize it real quick because it's an important thread of this topic. At that time, there was two cohorts of doctors, and they were trying to train Western trained doctors in Western medicine and Chinese medicine traditional doctors. And they had to make a training course for the Western trained doctors to understand Chinese medicine. So they summarized a lot of, especially Ming Dynasty approaches, in protocols, which became a course for Western doctors. I think it was about 8 months long or something like that. Um, the protocols from that course got exported to the West. And there was nothing called traditional Chinese medicine. They got exported to Europe and then later in the 70s to the United States. And we thought this was the 2,000-year-old medicine. Most people still do, not the one that was,
Mm.
made in the 60s. Um, and so, and then it got re-imported back, and now TCM is trained in China, is taught in China. So that's what we're learning. So that means, if we talk about root and branch a lot in nature's design, and that means things come from a source. So imagine we're on this huge tree that has a root way in the past and a root in nature, also, and we're way out on a leaf, and we're trying to understand the medicine, but we can only see the leaf, you know, and so it's like if you want to eat fruit, you like fruit, you go to the store and you buy fruit and it tastes wonderful, and then you leave it on the counter and 4 days later it's kind of getting moldy, and so it's not about the fruit, it's about knowing how the source of the tree, where it comes from. So there's something that feeds it. So my understanding, I mean, there's financial reasons why schools are closing, but my understanding at a deeper level is that it's not being fed by its roots in its Western expression since the 70s. So it was like buying fruit, which tasted good for a while
Mm.
and is now, because it's not being nourished by its root, it can't continue with these patterns of change and transformation, and it withers.
And what I think about when you say that is that it's really a cool time and a cool opportunity because obviously we can't change the past, but I kind of think it probably had to happen that way, that it probably needed to come out in a digestible package. That if Westerners were not going to suddenly have 50 years of lineage teaching experience from a master, and it needed to kind of come here somehow. Whether that was people who were actually Chinese doctors moving to different Western countries or different Western doctors or different people who are learning it. And I think that's probably an appropriate, like, stage of development,
Absolutely.
in the set like, in the '70s, in the '80s, in the '90s, and, there were very few people who were, let's say, outside of China who were really excellent at Chinese and even classical Chinese who could even read these texts, and so
Exactly.
people there were certain translations and people were working off of those translations, or they were mainly working off of these protocol textbooks, and I think that that's all really good, and these are the people who kinda laid the, almost like the kind of the distributed seeds, of these kind of plants that are not indigenous to the area to kind of start taking root so that now there are people who are like looking for an acupuncturist, but that now is maybe the time to say we can now make this like way kind of deeper in like real medicine and not to say that people who are doing it are not practicing real medicine, but there's something else that we're talking about
Right.
here.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with you too. And also just the fruit has done wonderful things. Like acupuncturists have helped many people around the world, whether it's, what you call higher level or, more day to day or whatever it is. So we ain't doing bad, with what we have. But when something like this happens, where all of a sudden schools shutting, schools shutting, schools shutting, there's two ways to approach that. One is like, oh, acupuncture was not as strong as we thought it was. And, maybe it's not that great.
or we can blame outsiders for
Or we can blame outsiders, yeah,
encroaching on our turf.
which never helps us. But,
Feels good in the moment.
the other thing is saying, well, it had its moment. and now it's trying to stimulate us to grow into a new way.
Mm.
That's kind of a healthier way of looking at change and transformation. Not that it's bad, but it's the model that came, it's outlived its time.
Yeah, and I kind of alluded at the beginning of this that I have a s like, a kind of a little bit of a different perspective. I'm born and raised in the United States, but I did my, acupuncture training in the UK, and I got a master's degree. And I so there's a few things that come from that, I was trying to remember exactly how much it cost me, but it was something along the lines it was like a 3-year master no, wait, it was 3-year clinical training plus a year thesis dissertation. But I think it was something like £8,000 a year or something like that. So I was also fortunate enough not to go into debt doing it, but I also have a pretty strong cynicism of the economics of higher education in the United States across the board, not specific to the acupuncture profession, that I think that there were certain changes that happened, I believe maybe in the '80s and '90s about how, like, lucrative student loans were, and they were really just trying to give them out, and it's like you talk about, working for the mafia. You literally those interest rates, and it's crazy, and so what I observed was that, again, aside from acupuncture, that, everyone was being encouraged to go to college, but I don't think that everyone needed to. It was like everyone went to college. And, when I lived in the UK, I noticed that it was much more common than it is here for people to go into a trade when they're young, and that there was no shame associated with that. Like, this is, my kind of growing up in the '80s is like, "Oh, I'm gonna become a tradesperson, like a plumber or an electrician," and it's like, "Oh, you must not be too bright." Well, no, those guys have, like, piles of cash under their bed. Like, they're doing just fine, but there's such a need for it. And then I think that, acupuncture training just fell victim to these, like, larger, trends where the schools probably were feeling like they were doing the right thing by going through the process to become, accredited in such a way where they would be eligible for these student loans, but then this kind of inflates the cost of the education. And then I'll also say something that I know is not popular with everyone, which is that I don't believe you need to have a degree in order to be a good, acupuncturist. Um,
Oh, no, I mean, plenty of people are in lineage systems in Asia, who don't have any degree, yeah.
and I think that people who have degrees might feel kind of protective of them, and it's what that
Sure,
differentiates
yeah.
them from other people. But at the end of the day, if you look at the skill set required, it doesn't, and it's not to say don't, I've got degrees, they're great, but it's not to say that I needed
You
those
see
degrees.
you see this in DAOM programs too. I think a lot of DAOM programs, again, I don't wanna be controversial, I believe everybody's doing their best, but when you really look at their content, you're like, "Really?" But I think its main draw is for people who feel like they didn't get enough and, they need more, especially in that idea of residency, but it's not always there in every DOM program, unfortunately, I think.
And one thing I'll add to that, because again, I'm sort of I look in these groups just to get a sense of what people are talking about. I'll go there to ask questions as well, and I'll try to give answers as well when where helpful. Is it's not rare or uncommon at all for someone who's considering a DAOM program to come in and say, "Is it worth it?" And not everyone's the same, but a lot of times the motivation is that they believe that they will receive a higher compensation after they do that. They will have higher, like, more respect from their medical colleagues if they do that degree and they have that title. And then I think at this point, because I've seen how the answers have changed over the years. I think that maybe 3 years ago, people weren't so sure, and a lot of people thought, "Yeah, maybe if you get DOM, maybe people really will, call you doc,"
Asians
and
and, Western doctors don't care. They don't know what it is. Yeah.
no, and now the answers are much more, of a similar vein, which is to say, no, like, if you if you are trying to increase your clinical knowledge, you wanna find a teacher that you really respect and resonate with and love learning from, and do that. Like, forget the title. Um, if you're after a title, after a title, I live in and I'm licensed in Rhode Island. Our title is doctor, so I got to skip the degree and just go for the title, but doesn't doesn't matter. you know, so it's yeah, that now people are much clearer that you wanna be clear on why you're going for that, that is it because you really wanna learn what they're teaching you? Is it really because of the status, and the title? If you believe that it's for more compensation, is that gonna be really true? There may be examples. I think there may be examples, there's always exceptions, where in order to be able to work in this hospital and be employed, maybe you do need it, but that's very rare.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's another issue here about, and it's about innovation and support. And I think I've told you this before. When people often ask me, "What's the difference between being a Western doctor and a Chinese medicine practitioner?" and they think it's going to be something about qi, needles. Actually, we use them in both. And I always say innovation is the difference. And I've mentioned this before, I think, but in my medical training, if I took a year off, the field had changed so drastically. I was way behind the curve when I came back. Like when I went to China, I came back. The field had changed. Things are being innovated, and they're being innovated by basic science. Pretty much, if I go to a Chinese medicine conference today, it's a version of the same conference I saw in 1992 when I started my training. Really? I mean, there's new pulse diagnosis systems. There's things around the edges, but there's been a lack of innovation, and I think that's another reason why the training programs get parched. Western medicine is fed by basic science that filters into clinical practice, like cancer. The field I worked in, it is fed very strongly by genetics research, cancer research. We don't have that. What do we have research in Chinese medicine? We ask Western medicine to view us and decide if our treatments are effective. That's something very different, and that's problematic on many reasons, as you know. And even with that, as you know, as you've promoted and in your writings, there still shows that it works, but that's something different than basic research. So, like, if we go back to that root branch idea, like there's a root that feeds a tree, basic science is the root that feeds cancer practice, and innovation. And we don't have that. What is basic science in Chinese medicine? The classics are our basic science and the study, not just like I read a book and I have a subjective feeling that this passage means this. But this idea we have about text archaeology, this is a very formal way of going back into the classics as an archaeology site, looking at things in a formal way, studying them in groups in ways that are open for discussion and revisions of interpretations, validating them, etc. And that has brought out so much new information that has led to so much innovation. But right now it's contained in this little corner of the world where we live, where we're doing this archaeology. But, like we have a new model of cancer, we just gave that talk. Ideas about resistant infectious diseases, what is an illness, so many things that is not there in the TCM culture because we don't understand the terms as well. We're way out on the leaf of the tree. So you don't have to be the sinologist who spends 8 years learning how to translate the Neijing, but there should be people in the field who are doing that.
Yeah,
Just as like in cancer, for the oncologist, he doesn't have to know about all the things about genetics research, but he or she needs those people to be there. And that's
mhm,
something we don't have. So I think when we talk about like things are going down, it's a invitation for a new chapter. It's not just like it doesn't work. It's like, oh, we need to change something. And this is one of the aspects of the change.
absolutely, and I think, one of the things that you've, mentioned, throughout this conversation as well is, like because there's different sides to the I don't know, the economics of this equation, right? So there's the cost of education, there's the amount someone can earn when they come out, there's the amount that people are willing to pay, there's the amount the insurance is willing to pay, and all these different things, but it part of it is if you are going for a really advanced training, do you come out equipped to solve ex problems that people wanna spend a lot of money to solve? And I
Right.
know that that's just talking about a private, paying, but let's just talk about that for a moment, and there's different ways to make things more accessible.
Oh
Um,
my god. You know,
but
like, if we went to insurance companies and said, "Give me your 100 most difficult cases and pay me $200,000," like, they would save so much, a year.
oh, yeah.
They would save so much money in what we're doing at this level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can say kind of personally based on the training I've done since my kind of original training degrees, which are kind of in very different ways of looking at things, I can solve much more expensive problems, and for less than it would cost them elsewhere.
Like the case example we gave in the beginning, $250,000
Yeah.
hospital bill and $20 worth of herbs,
Right, or I mean, and I was sharing an example with you, not quite on the same caliber, but maybe from the perspective of the student, that because one of the things that comes up with this conversation is that because in the United States we have licensure, and we should maybe talk about other countries too, because in some countries, like in some European countries, you have to be a medical doctor in order to practice acupuncture. In some cases, it's like voluntary regulation and registration. In the United States, there's, a bit of a dependence on what state you're in, so there's all these complexities. Probably the most typical scenario in the United States is that you need to be licensed, and that's through the medical board in your state, but there's, variation on the scope, but all that boils down to is that there's a real focus on needling, and that if you need to be in many states, you need to be licensed as an acupuncturist or as another profession who has it within their scope in order to use needles. And what does it mean where if you have an alternative educational model that does not prepare you for boards, then how do you practice this medicine? And I was kind of thinking about it like, well, there's kind of a number of ways because one is without using needles, and one is maybe alternative ways of doing it legally and ethically with needles. But without needles, what I wanted to share was after the first practicum that I experienced with you, I went back home and I had a patient who I'd been seeing for a few years, but she was in her early 20s, really quite healthy, had been doing really well under my care. She developed this like really particularly big growth on her neck. And they said it was kind of like a benign sort of tumor thing, but it was big enough and it wasn't going away that they were gonna operate on it to remove it, but it was extensive enough that when she went in for the pre-surgical, they said it was gonna be like an 8 to 10-hour surgery, and they were gonna basically lift her face off to do this thing, and she's like a pretty girl in her 20s, a young lady, and, she was not excited, and, but, I'm working with her and trying to help prepare her for it and do what we can do, and when I came back from that practicum, because you had taught me really fundamental principles of ecology that really are not so focused on needles. It's that the needle is the tool, and you kind of figure out when that tool needs to be used, and it often doesn't need to be. I was able to do a treatment with her based on those principles of nature and ecology that did not involve needles, and this was, like, the day before her surgery, and she said that when she woke up, not only could she see that it was smaller, but for the first time in months, when she swallowed, she couldn't feel it. And when she went in for the surgery, because obviously only had 1 treatment, right? I didn't have time to do much with her. When she went in for the surgery, they said that it only needed to be a 2-hour procedure, and they didn't need to take her face off, and all of these things, but this was, like, coming from just a very different way of viewing medicine and my role and what I'm trying to do than what I had been trained to do, and if I had been using needles and I'd been using the way I'd been trained previously, I wouldn't have gone anywhere near this or trying to help with that with a 10-foot pole. I would have been giving her some sort of relaxing treatment to help calm her and, like, balance her nervous system before her treatment, but with this, I was able to kinda look and do something that was really safe and non-invasive that I thought maybe we can help make this less congested, and it was beautiful, and so I just wanted to kinda plant that seed because I know that people have the question about, like, "Well, what about the needles? If you're not an acupuncturist, you're not allowed to do them, and if you're not using needles, then you're not an acupuncturist, and how does this work?" And so I wanted to just point that out as, like, one piece of it, as all the stuff that you can do without needles when you're trained like this.
It's true. Needle's always the legal sticking point in the US, for example. You need a license for that, and there's reasons for that and so forth. In this new model that we're developing from the classics, acupuncture is a form of surgery, and just like when you go into the hospital or you go to your doctor, they don't just do surgery. They do surgery for an indication after a diagnosis and a treatment plan and a review of the risks and benefits, and surgery is actually the last thing we normally do. We would rather, it's the same with needles, we would rather do so many other things to restore ecology before we use needles. But when you need them, it's a surgical technique. But there is that issue. There's this other issue that this all comes from our tradition, but most people don't know it or haven't been exposed to it. And so there's this other thing we find in the text archaeology, that the original vision was very different, and that there was a period of time where it was lost, where things went on to a different trajectory of point action and so forth. And so we call it pre-disruption medicine. But it's like a treasure trove of information. And if we look at the profession going down, this is a great source of giving it new life. But it requires people to come and invest in that journey. Like medical school is not something you learn in a weekend. You have to show up over time. And so I'm very respectful of the students who come to our class. They're often teachers. Can you imagine like going through all your training and then say, I'm going to kind of like do it again, you know, with this strange guy for 2 years, that's a lot, you know. So, and the problem now is that we have entrenched systems like
Yeah.
ways insurance reimburse, or that people who write the board exam questions, again, I'm not criticizing them at all, but things become entrenched. I also think the student loan issue is a huge one. It's very hard for a for-profit business to turn down free money. You don't have to be a crook. It's just really hard to turn it down when someone signs a paper and you get a check for $50,000. That's a real big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's there's some challenges there, but I think, you've talked about this before, I've heard other teachers talk about this before, this idea that if you have a system that's not working very well, a lot of people will notice that, and they will complain about it, and they will
Right.
lament and think, "What can I possibly do? I'm so small and it's so big." And there's this message that I keep hearing over and over again, which is build something better over here. Don't try to fight that system. Don't try to
Exactly.
dismantle that system. Don't lose tons of sleep over it. You want to build something better over here. And so I think when we're talking about different educational models, which is attached to different medical models, which is attached to a different idea of medicine and the problems that it can solve, usually the frame that people are coming in with are based on these existing systems, and that this educational model kind of, I suppose, asks you to kind of think a little bit outside of the box, which is to say that, for example, the training that you offer and other teachers who are kind of these senior teachers who provide these alternative clinical models, like, they're not gonna prepare you for the boards, So, if people are kind of worried about that, stop worrying,
As a
like, they're
matter of
not gonna.
fact, they're going to tell you like the questions on the board are wrong.
Yeah, they're gonna mess you up for the boards,
They're
and
going to mess you up in the words. Yeah.
yeah, we have some students who come through and it's like, "Okay, you need to compartmentalize this
Yeah. Right.
information,
It's hard.
forget about," so it will mess you up for the boards, and so,
Yeah.
this is not a path that's taking you down the existing professional path, and it's not to say that that path is bad or wrong and people shouldn't do it, but what we're talking about is a different path.
So there's a real important thing in what you said, and that's models of change. And believe me, I've thought a lot about models of change in this work, because when in the beginning, like back in 2010, I was like, "Whoa, there's so much here! It's going to change everything: malaria, tuberculosis, cancer." Which it can actually. And naively, I thought, well, as a doctor, I'm just going to go to the medical school and like I'll write a paper and it's going to be accepted, and then everything's going to change, right? Well, that's just ridiculous. I went to medical school. I was a visiting scholar down in San Diego, and first of all, the politics of that, papers don't really change things all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And also in discussions with them, they said, look, Ed, our system's kind of broken. The journal articles, issues, the influences of industry, all that stuff. We don't need you to join a sinking ship. And I was like, ah, okay. We need you to make a better ship and float alongside of us.
Mm.
That was one thing. And here's the thing about change also, often our first impulse is to blame someone. It's like it's the schools, they're gouging us, or whatever, which puts you in a powerless position right away. And most people are doing their best, as we say. And then there's model of change. And also arguing with people never works. Telling you that you're wrong. How many times has that worked in your life? It doesn't work. It just entrenches the other side, right? So let's scratch that one off the list, right? So that schools, you're wrong, and maybe there can be some change there, but that's not going to be our approach. Where do we look for wisdom? Nature. What is nature? How does nature make change? Well, say like climate change right now. In my yard, some plants are struggling, others are doing well. When an area of ecology is struggling, and you plant something different that flourishes, you just have to place it there and nature makes the change. Like a whole meadow could be replanted or reseeded with a kind of plant that's thriving there. So the idea with this is focus on like this source of where new change could come from, which is in classics, basic science research, as we talked about, and do a good job there and train people and they will treat people and it'll start to spread through the margins. And what happens then is when people see that, hospitals and businesses pay attention at a certain point.
Mm.
And that's where organic change comes from.
Yeah.
And in the end of the day, there's also this agency issue like, I can't change everything, but I can change how I work with the people in front of me and how I study. And that does make change. Yeah.
Yeah. This is cool. Yeah, I know it's a tricky one. There's a lot of complexity out there, but I'm really pleased that we're having this discussion. I when I kind of usually watch it and observe it, there's a lot of disempowerment. There's a lot of blame. There's a lot of uncertainty for the future, and for people who've come through. That if you've taken a certain professional path and then seeing that the market or whoever is saying that it's, like, not viable, people feel a bit scared. So it's nice because there are alternatives here in the clinical model, in the problems we can solve, and how we educate and all of those things, and so it's nice just to let people know that that exists and that the the standard path is still definitely there, for people who want to, take out loans if they need to and sit boards and become, licensed, and that has its place, and that, that has us in the VA and that has us in hospitals and things like that, but it's not the only way, and I think a lot of people, people go into various professions, including ours, for different reasons, and so for some people, the reasons that they're going into this would be better served by this alternative model, perhaps, and other teachers as well who are doing something as opposed to that kind of more, well-trodden, model that's not gonna lead them where they're hoping.
Yeah. Like right now, my advice to anybody would be like, go to the cheapest, quickest place you can to get a
Yeah.
license if you're going that route, of
Go
which
to the UK.
there are some examples like here in Portland. There's some examples of that, and then study deeper. I also want to say like there's the system wide issue of this, of schools closing, and then there's the personal level. And the personal level is like, how am I doing? So like I live in Portland, and there's an acupuncturist like every block here. So you can feel like, oh, there's not enough patients to go around. And here's the thing: every person on the planet is a patient.
Yeah.
There are so many patients. And here's the other thing: a lot of people do good work, very good work. They're good listeners. They know how to do the treatments that they learned in school. There's not so many great practitioners. And those people are always in demand. I've never advertised ever. It's all word of mouth. I've always been full. And that's because the world is full of patients. It's not to say what's out there is bad, because it's also helping people. But like when you come in with a disease that 20 doctors haven't helped you with, or is life threatening or is debilitating and no one else has been able to touch it, and you help that person, they immediately go out and tell all their friends, and you have a line out your door.
Yep.
So then, even though there's this thing in the profession, you're doing well, but you have to know this original material so that you can
Yeah.
function at what they would have considered a higher, a more informed level, maybe.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Anything else that you would, add to people who are interested in different ways of, navigating this discussion?
I would say this also, like, we're at a difficult time right now where everything seems to be breaking, and it causes a distress in us. Our stories are breaking. They don't have substance in the same way. And it's existentially disturbing, for people. And no matter what happens in the world or with acupuncture schools, what I have found for myself and what I see in my students is that if you are in a community of people that are studying like root medicine or engaged at deeper level conversations, it calms down and influences your life independent of what happens in the world. So again, it's that idea of agency. I may not be able to fix everything, but I can attend to what's in front of me, you know, and that's immensely powerful. I think. I don't know if you had that experience or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. That when you have people coming together around core, healthy, life affirming values, and you show up repeatedly, then there's like a kind of an end in itself there, and it makes life easier to navigate. And you may learn some medicine, some clinical skills on top of that as well. But there's definitely, because that's another thing about the acupuncture profession, depending on where you are in your situation. For many people, it's very professionally isolated. Um,
It is, and there's this really core thing about nature's principles, and this thing about we talked about being, are you fed from root in root branch motions? Are you picking fruit? And so there's a lot of undernourishment in the field because it's what I call the hungry growth syndrome of the continuing education circuit. Like I eat something, I go for a weekend, and then I'm hungry again. I eat something, I go for a weekend, and then I'm hungry again. And when you rebalance and get root nourishment, and whichever way you do it, all of a sudden life starts to make sense in a different way.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's the other thing, as keeping my finger on the pulse of what's going on by watching profession. There is this, it's a real addiction to continuing professional development, and that's not just in Chinese medicine. Because I also,
It's on the
um,
internet. It's everything 7 minutes to like improve everything.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I have different, like, kind of clinical areas, and it's similar. And in the last few years, probably the biggest shift that I've made, which I could recommend to anyone, is that when you come across teachers who understand more of a first principles understanding, they're not teaching you a technique; they're teaching you a way of understanding that may involve techniques, then you don't need to go from seminar to seminar, and you don't perpetually have that feeling of never knowing enough, and never having enough certification or whatever it is, that you don't have that hunger because you can then go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Our biggest challenges in life, one of them is it's not doing the work, it's finding the path.
Mm,
And like if you find the path, and like if you start in the classics, I mean, that's a good path for Chinese medicine. It's not going to let you down 3 months from now. Then all you have to do is you can relax and just start walking, you know. But if you don't know what path to take, I mean, you're just lost.
and perhaps I think looking back on my own professional journey, I think when you go through a degree program in Chinese medicine, you think you found the path.
It's very enticing. I call it the Chinese medicine school syndrome. It's like you show up the first day. It's amazing. They're talking about chi in the universe. The teachers are from China, like you love it. And then about halfway through, you're like, something's not right here. These arguments don't quite add up. And it's everybody's saying the opposite stuff a little bit. And then but I'm halfway through and I've got a student loan. And then you get through the clinic and I'm not sure I learned everything, but I better finish. But it's there. It's the promise of a profession. It's a real promise. It's one the profession can deliver on. It's not, this is real stuff. But we have to get our orientations right.
Makes sense. Well, this is I'm been very, excited to have this conversation with you. I think, especially I remember you talking about the, students or graduates living out of their cars, and these are things that we need to talk about. This is part of our shadow, and that's not everyone's experience. There are definitely, practitioners out there who are doing a really great job. Although I would say from my observations, those are practitioners who have done a lot of, coming up with or finding alternative models from what they graduated with, right? So these are kind of innovators, and they're doing great, and, they deserve every bit of success that they have, but they're kind of proving the point that they are exceptions because they went out and found something different.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I think that's enough for today.
Alright.
All
Well,
right.
that was fun, and I'll look forward to the next one.
Yeah, and I love seeing the forest behind you. That's really wonderful. Yeah.
I'm in the forest learning from the trees.
There you go. All right. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.